Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcast, and this is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK Police Force. Thanks very much for coming back. If you've been before, and if not, welcome. Really good downloads again last week. Excellent, thank you. And some nice comments on YouTube again. So don't forget you can go on YouTube and add comments or ask questions or hurl abuse, whatever you prefer. So that's good to see. Several people liked the extensive work that my huge background technical team went to for adding in the rain noises last week, particularly appropriate as I was obviously telling a watery marine story. Of course, the reality is it just started raining while I was doing the podcast on my caravan roof, and yeah, it worked out okay. Hopefully you could hear it all right and it didn't ruin it too much. It set the scene a bit perhaps for the work, so that was good. Okay, onwards then this week. This is episode 51, and we're going to talk a bit more. We're going to start off with a marine job, and then we're going to talk about the dive team and how that came about for me. Move on to that. Hopefully you'll find this interesting. So the first one was a 999 call. If you remember before, I said that a lot of the work is SAR work, search and rescue work for the Marine Unit, in terms of people threatening to jump off the bridges across the River Thames in London, or have actually jumped off the bridges and are in the water. You obviously only have a very fine line, a small amount of time, a small window, should I say, that you can actually save those people, and it varies obviously. In the summer, slightly warmer, but trust me, if you got in the Thames at any time of the year, you're never going to get in there, even in August when it's 35 degrees outside, and go, oh, this is lovely and toasty. It's always cold. Sort of the warmest it gets is probably 10 degrees, maybe 12 degrees. And you perhaps don't think, in your mind, you're putting that to air temperatures. If you've got no experience of sort of working in and around water or diving, that's actually quite cold, 10 or 12 degrees. Most people wouldn't choose to be in wetsuits in that. I mean, you can do if you were surfing or something, doing something physical, but certainly divers, for example, would be in dry suits, and we'll definitely come on to that later. And in that sort of temperature of water, pretty much any time of the year, you're looking at 5 minutes probably in the water with no sort of wetsuit, dry suit, anything like that. And if you've fallen or jumped in the river, you've probably got 5 minutes before you start to lose the feeling in your limbs, your legs and your fingers and your arms. Maybe a little bit longer if you're paddling about quite a bit. But what you're doing is you're burning up a lot of energy by doing that, and you start to cramp up. Certainly 10 minutes, I would say, is the absolute max you've got. Now, even with the fast boats that the Marine Unit has, if they were at the base at the time, or you were unlucky, and when you went in on a particular bridge, if they were the furthest away they could be, they could easily have a 10-15 minute run to you, depending on how busy the river was and the time of day. And of course, then you've got to be found. Don't forget, the moment you hit the water, unless you're perhaps lucky enough to go in at slack water when the tide isn't moving much, if there's sort of 4, 5, 6 knots of tide running, very quickly you'll be swept away. So we might have been told so-and-so's jumped in, off of this bridge. And the reality is, by the time we get there 10 minutes later, they could be a long way off. Well, in that scenario, the Coast Guard have sort of tidal software that they can enter, and they can sort of put on their screens the person believed to enter the water here at London Bridge. And that machine knows all the current tide situations for the next probably infinity, because tides can be worked out well in advance. And they'll be able to say, we estimate they'll currently be here. So they will then set up a sort of search and rescue mission based around their calculations that come from that sort of computer software. But on this particular job, we were at the base still at Wapping near Tower Bridge, and we had a call to a male threatening to jump, as I say, a very sort of common call. So ran down what we call the brow, the sort of pontoon that leads to where the boats are tied up, jumped on the boats. You have the skipper who's obviously on the engines, quickly starts those up while the others are untying the ropes. And the moment you're ready, that's it, you're off flat out, 45 knots, 50 mile an hour up the River Thames, considerably over the 12 knot speed limit, much to various other river users' horror, particularly the commercial guys who I think we've talked about before would suggest that you'd caused all sorts of damage, whether you had or hadn't, because you were going so fast. But at the end of the day, you're talking about someone's life here, so you're not going to, go poodling up like Miss Daisy. You are going to basically give it everything that it's got to get up there. So I think we were about 10 minutes away maybe from this particular bridge, so we went hammering up, and all we had was male threatening to jump, and that's quite often all you get. I mean, in fairness, you don't need a lot more. Let's get to the bridge, let's assess it and see what's actually going on. So on this particular occasion, I think we were the first there, or maybe the lifeboat we've got at the time, at the same time as us. And if you remember, there's various resources that can be used on the river. There's obviously the police boats, and then there's lifeboats. Sometimes the Coast Guard are up there. Sometimes you have the Port of London Authority would have one of their boats up there and would assist. And it's not unusual as well for the London Fire Brigade. They've got a fire boat that's on the river, and they would very much help as well. Now, they're all different sort of boats and have different abilities. So, for example, the fire boat was particularly useful because it was a landing craft style of boat, and it didn't have propellers. It had jet engines that sort of pushed water out the back rather than propellers, and therefore it could basically be grounded. It could be run up the beach. So if there's any real shallow work to do, we would perhaps send them in. And the lifeboat was the same as well, had jets on it, and was able to go very shallow and potentially put itself on the beach. The police vessels didn't have that. We did have some boats like that, but our sort of day-to-day vessel didn't. It had outdrives, which is like the bottom end of a sort of an outboard engine, if you like, that sticks out the back of the boat. So it has a propeller that hangs down. So something you very much needed to be aware of. Now, you could tilt those up a bit, but only so far. And also, if you tilted up too far, when you came to use it and use those engines for manoeuvring, if the propellers were out of the water, then it made a lot of splashes and a lot of water everywhere, but didn't actually do anything for you. So you had to be aware of sort of the angle that your outdrive engines were at all times. So we go hammering up to this bridge. We get there. I think the lifeboat were there about the same time as us, as I said. And what you need to do is, so firstly, you're looking to assess which way is the tide going. So I think on this occasion, the tide was going out. So we put one boat, I think it was us actually, went up tide of the river. Now, if someone hits the water, it's very unlikely that they're going to end up going against the tide. But, you could be there for several hours, and maybe the tide is going to change direction in the next 2 hours. So you need to cover all those options. Plus, as we've discussed before, there's a lot of sort of weird tidal anomalies and pools, some of them named Dead Men's Pool and thing, so that if you went in the river in a certain bit, you might actually move against the tide or be swirled around, or, end up in like a washing machine type effect where you're held in position. So had you fallen in one of those, you wouldn't necessarily do what was expected of you in terms of how the tide would affect you. So we went up tide, and where we had a good view of the Mail. Lifeboat went down tide. I think off to one side of us we had the LFB boat, the fire brigade, large sort of landing craft boat, and I'm pretty sure that there was also a Port of London Authority boat or someone knocking around in the background as well that was able to assist, because the more the merrier, really. When you actually come to physically drag someone out of the water, it's really difficult, because even if they're a very light person, if they've got heavy waterlogged clothing on, so they might have thick jackets or all sorts of things, in worst case scenario like a puffer jacket or something, which is like a big sponge and would just soak up all the water. So to physically drag someone out of the water who remember that may be intent on committing suicide, and therefore would actually surprisingly physically fight you. If you were trying to drag them into the boat, they would be pushing away from the boat. And you might have a boat hook. I've had boat hooks before. I've been pushing them out to people, saying grab hold, and I'll drag you in, throwing them life rings. They're actively pushing those away and kind of deliberately ducking under the water, trying to finish themselves off, which is quite distressing to see, obviously. So it's not as easy as you'd think. Now, the police boats actually weren't brilliant for dragging people in either, because they had what's called a swim platform. So that's a platform that extends out the stern of the boat, the back of the boat, and it's just above the water level most of the time. So you'd have to climb out of the sort of safety of the confines of the boat and then hang off the back to be able to drag people in. But unfortunately, that's exactly where the propellers were. So as a skipper, you had to be really, really careful that you would maneuver the boat into position so that the guy or girl in the water would perhaps drift onto you, or you would drift onto them, and then you would have to make absolutely sure that your engines were in neutral so those propellers weren't turning. And of course, it might be really, really close to the edge. A couple of times when we were recovering people, I was watching the depth sounder, and we would run aground in anything less than about a metre of water. And you might have stopped those engines in 1.5 meters, and the tide is pushing you onto the beach. So you desperately want to get away from there, but they're still recovering the person at the stern of the vessel. So you can't now put it in gear because you'll chop them to pieces, you know, with the propeller. So you certainly couldn't do that. So on this occasion, we sat and watched this guy. He was a bit different. He was completely naked, which was unusual. If you imagine, this is central London. So initially, police and fire brigade and ambulance haven't really had a chance to shut off the bridge. So you've still got members of the public walking across to this rather strange sight of the completely naked male sat on the edge of the bridge. And not only was he naked, but he also had a rope tied around his waist. And then to that rope, he tied a number of bricks that he'd secured to himself around this sort of belt he'd made around his middle. So clearly he was intent on, you know, doing himself some harm, and obviously intended that if he took the decision to jump in, he was going to sink immediately, which unfortunately sometimes did happen. Well, they'd be surprised how buoyant generally the human body is. Certainly initially, you know, quite often people float up. But what you do get when you hit the water, no matter how committed you are to, you know, finishing yourself off, you hit the water and you get what's called cold water shock. Now, it doesn't matter if you're an Olympic swimmer, you know, someone who's a commercial diver and completely used to cold water or whatever. It's a physical reaction. You cannot stop it. So you hit that water. Firstly, you can get what's called a sort of mammalian, as in mammal, reflex in the back of your throat that can sort of seal off your throat. That's your body trying to protect you from ingesting water, taking water in. So that can happen. But more likely, and we've all experienced it when we've walked into the sea, perhaps, and it's a bit cold and we thought, or a lake or wherever, and you kind of get that, you know, sharp intake of breath. That is this cold water shock scenario. And what it does is certainly makes you take a big breath. Now, if you can imagine, if you've just jumped in off a bridge, and when your body forces you to take that breath, you're a metre under the water because you have, you know, hit the water. And if that mammalian reflex hasn't kicked in and sort of closed your throat off, then when you take that sharp inhale under the water, obviously you are taking in a load of water, and clearly that is a very bad scenario. So quite often people find, you know, extreme cold, very heavy breathing, you know, none of your limbs work as you would expect. You know, it's almost like you're sort of very, very drunk in the water and your arms and legs are flailing around. There's a bit of a panic mode sets in. Everyone has that. You can't stop it. It doesn't matter how good you are in the water. And that will occur, you know, and I think the time varies depending on, you know, time of day and all sorts of various physical factors and water temperatures, etc. But certainly for the first couple of minutes or so, that's what's going to happen to you. If you can get through those couple of minutes, then slowly your sort of use of your limbs will start to you know, return, and your breathing will settle down, and then you might be in a position to help yourself. And certainly they suggest that if you go in water, don't try and do anything to start with. Just keep your head above water and sort of go with it for that first couple of minutes until that cold water shock goes away. And in fact, what the UK Lifeboat are now saying is that you very much should try, very difficult of course, but this is if you're trying to save yourself, to relax in the water and effectively lie back in the water, because generally the human body is buoyant, as we've already said. So if you just lay back and can relax and keep still, and maybe just a little bit of movement on your hands and feet, you'll actually just lay there and float on the surface. When you start thrashing around and panicking, that's unfortunately when you go under. But I totally get that if you're not expecting to go in the water, that is pretty much the reaction you'd expect. So we sat there watching this guy, and on the bridge we had police officers, and now he was roughly in the middle of the bridge. So this creates a bit of a dilemma, because on one side of the bridge you'd have one London borough and one sort of mini police force, if you like, and on the other side you'd have another London borough. So there's every chance you could have all of one side, you know, cops from each borough on each side. And should there be any offences and things going forward, it became a little bit difficult as to who was dealing with it, because I don't think it's quite like sort of America with, you know, county lines and things. Everyone can deal with it, but it comes down to then perhaps a bit of a bun fight that, well, really, he was on your borough, so you should be dealing, you know. And you can imagine busy cops who, you know, have lots on their plate already would definitely try and perhaps shuffle someone across to the other side so that it wasn't them that was dealing. But so we had cops on the bridge. They've now shut the bridge off, and members of the public have stopped going across. This guy is clearly in some distress. You know, the fact that he is naked and has lots of bricks tied around his waist would sort of lead you to that. And then people on the bridge will try and engage with him. We couldn't really do it from the boats. You couldn't really, speak to them on the boats. Unless you were at very high tide, you were probably going to be, 10 metres below them. And with the engine noises and wind and rain and things, a bit like the end of the podcast last week, you would, you just couldn't really communicate with someone, especially if you're actually trying to listen to, what is their problem, what's their issue, why have they found themselves on the bridge today, and generally trying to sort of chat through and convince them not to do it. So it would quite often fall to the cops on the bridge or ambulance staff, or quite often we would have the fire brigade called as well, who would be on top of the bridge because they may have been some use, for various reasons. We've had people sort of half jump off and end up being lower down, and we sometimes might need to use ladders to recover them if they've not actually ended up in the water and things. And generally there'll be somebody on the bridge that will kind of take that lead, and will start to speak to the person. And on this occasion, it was a fireman. And he'd clearly started to engage with this guy and was going through the motions and just having a chat with the guy, really. He said, look, I'm not going to approach you. I'm not going to touch you. I'm just going to lean here beside you. I'm out of your reach, and, you're out of my reach, so I'm not going to interfere with you in any way. And he just started chatting to him and doing exactly as you would hope, and just speaking to the guy like a human and finding out kind of what has led him to be into this position today. Because, I think potentially a lot of people are only sort of one paycheck away from finding themselves in this situation. It doesn't, the sorts of people we found on the bridge, they might have had alcohol or drugs issues. They could have just had a breakup from a partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. That was very common. Obviously, they might be drunk at the time, so they're not thinking straight. They could have lost their job. There's obviously a multitude of reasons why people end up in that position. So you're definitely looking to speak to them, try and establish why that is. So thankfully, after a while, this fireman, gained enough of this guy's confidence to get close to him until he was actually pretty much touching him. And he basically did a very good job and convinced this guy that, come on, let's go and talk this out. It's freezing out here. Let's go and get a cup of tea and we'll talk this over. A classic British thing, a cup of tea will sort all the problems out. But thankfully the guy went with it, and he did climb down off the bridge, of his own accord, and was taken off into an ambulance. And then from there, somebody is almost certainly going to go off with the ambulance crew and probably go and have some sort of mental health assessment in one of the local hospitals. And that's what happened with this guy. So yeah, that was a good ending to that one. Unfortunately, it didn't always end like that, but it did on that day. So that was good. So it was about this sort of time that I became aware of the dive team that worked within the Marine unit. Now, technically, they're called the UCSST, which is the Underwater and Confined Spaces Search Team. So they did quite a few different roles, not just the diving side of it. So I knew a couple of people on the team and I had a chat with them. They were basically based within Wapping, where the Marine unit is, but down in the basement they had separate offices where they carried out their work and their training, and also a lot of their kit was serviced down in the basement as well. So I'd been doing some private diving myself, sort of scuba diving in the English Channel and things, for maybe 2 or 3 years at that point. I think it was about that long. So I wasn't massively experienced, but I had some experience. But the point I would make is you do not have to have any sort of experience to join the dive team. We took in people that had no diving experience at all. And in actual fact, if they were comfortable in the water, I think, as we discussed before, sometimes it's easier to get someone who has never had any sort of diving experience before and teach them from scratch. So ultimately they were looking for someone to move on to the team, and they would almost certainly always recruit from the boats, because obviously the dive team used the boats a lot still and needed to do various sort of marine boat type work along with the dive work. So if you came from the Marine unit, you were already trained within the boat, so that meant you could do that kind of dual role. So certainly as a diver you could dip back into the teams and help out the boats anytime, but it wasn't the other way around, unfortunately. You were either a diver or you weren't. So it wasn't like people from the boats could come and help out the dive team, or maybe on certain levels, but generally that didn't sort of happen. So I ended up applying for the team officially, and there was an aptitude test again, much as there was to be on the marine unit. At this point, I'd been on the marine unit for about 2 years. I've been on the boats. So I was taken off to the swimming pool one day, and there was a series of extra tests to check my sort of suitability for the dive team. So there was a swim test, similar to what we'd had to actually join the marine unit, but a lot harder. Once again, it was clothed, and you had X amount of lengths of sort of a 50-metre pool to do. But the difference was this time it was timed, and it had to be done, you know, at some speed. And it was really, to start with, you know, test your confidence and ability in the water, but also to show your fitness, because, you know, to keep up a fast pace over however many lengths, I think it was 6 lengths, in clothing, you know, you had to work quite hard and be pretty fit to be able to achieve the relevant pastime. So I managed to do that okay. There was another height jump. Needed to just test again that you were quite comfortable jumping into water from height, so that was done off a dive board. And then there was some sort of scuba tests. Now, bearing in mind, you know, you may never have dived before, so you were definitely at a bit of an advantage if you'd actually done some diving before. And like I said, I was a vaguely competent diver at this point, not experienced by any means, but had certainly done a bit. So I was pretty comfortable in the pool with the sort of scuba kit on. So initially it was just get in the pool, put some normal scuba kit on. So that's a half mask, you know, it covers your eyes, and you have a sports diving regulator, which is the one you sort of put in your mouth and you clamp down on with your teeth. And they just had you swimming around a bit, just to have a look at you and make sure you're comfortable. And then we did some different things. Some people don't like, for example, taking off your mask. So now you've just got your breathing regulator in, but no mask on at all. So they would test that. Some people really don't like that. So again, it was just to see how comfortable you were. Now, don't forget, this was, you know, a normal sort of heated pool. It was quite often where the sort of the diving board teams for the Olympics and stuff trained, which is where we'd use. So it was literally, you know, you have, you know, various people swimming up and down doing their lengths, and then we would take off a bit of that area and just sort of rope it off while we were doing our aptitude tests. So you do mask off and swimming about, and then we also did some tests where you had one of the dive team beside you, and you would either put on a blacked out mask so you couldn't see where you're going, or you would leave the mask off. In fact, I think we did both. And you know, on the bottom of swimming pools they have tiles, and then in between that tiles is the grouting, you know, that sort of holds those tiles in place. We would, you know, you'd have your hand guided by the diver beside you, and he would put your fingers onto one of those grout lines, and you would swim the length of the pool with no mask on and just your scuba kit, with your fingers on that grout line, and you had to show that you could follow that grout line without deviating too much. And to be honest with you, it wasn't really about the grout line side of it. It was more about that confidence again. You were quite happy, not just for a short time without a mask, but, you know, for a good few minutes that it took to swim up and down. And the other thing was, bearing in mind you couldn't see, you were relying on the diver beside you to stop you before you hit the wall the far end, because you couldn't tell when the end of the pool was coming. So you'd be swimming along, invariably with your eyes closed, with no mask, with your fingers running along the grout line, and a qualified police diver beside you, and he or she would just simply stop you prior to you getting to that far wall and basically face planting into the wall, and then turn you around and get you to follow back the grout line. Now that sounds straightforward, and it is to a degree, but some people really didn't like knowing, you know, where the end of the pool was. They didn't like, and it's quite difficult to pass this complete trust over to the person beside you, and trust that they will stop you from hitting the wall at the end and turn you around. We had a couple of people who you know, ended up kind of failing because they just didn't like that, and they'd end up waving their arms about in front of them, you know, or coming to the surface because they weren't happy. And it's all really testing that confidence and seeing how you were. Because the thing is, we would test, if they were a qualified diver and were used to this, we'd also get them to put masks back on under the water, because if you're not a diver, you may not be aware, but if you take your mask off underwater and you had a reason to then put it back on, if you put the mask back on and tilt your head back and then just tilt out the bottom of the mask but exhale through your nose, so blow bubbles out through your nose with your head tilted back and the bottom only of the mask tilted up, you can actually clear a mask of water. So you've got the ability to, if your mask came off for whatever reason in the water, you could put a mask back on and clear it underwater so that you could see again. So that was something that would get you to do if you were an experienced diver. You know, obviously you wouldn't if you hadn't, because that's a skill that takes some learning. Now, I managed to pass the dive test. There were some others as well that they threw in there on the aptitude test. But that wasn't a guarantee that you could still become a police diver. It was a good indication, and it certainly allowed both the dive team to look at you and look at me, you know, but also for you to sort of, you know, work with the dive team and see what you thought. But don't forget, as I said, you're doing this in a kind of, I don't know, 25 or 30 degree pool, you know, in your shorts and t-shirt. And you, regardless of kind of what tests you were asked to do, you knew that it wasn't going to be that bad. The water was clean, you know, it had chlorine in, you could open your eyes if you wanted to, and no terrible diseases were going to get in your eyes. So it wasn't a complete guide that this is a person that could go on to become a police diver, because that's a very different kettle of fish. And in actual fact, that was proved one day, because fast forwarding a few years to when I was a dive supervisor, we had somebody who we put through these dive tests, and she seemed very comfortable in the water. She carried out all the tests perfectly. And then we gave her the opportunity, would you like to also do some sort of aptitude tests in one of the local docks? And that will just give you an idea of a bit more of a feel for, you know, what police diving is actually about. And she was like, absolutely, yeah, I'd like that opportunity. And this girl was pretty much lined up to go off and complete her course, you know. So in fact, she had a slot, she was booked in. So we took her off to the docks, and sure enough, we put in what we call a shot line, which is basically a thick rope that with a heavy weight on the bottom that's lowered to the bottom. It was a 6 metre dock, so it wasn't very deep, but it was quite representative of police diving work, although this particular dock was picked because it wasn't one of our worst docks, and it actually had a little bit of visibility in it, which was pretty unusual for any of our work. So what would happen is she went in with one of our experienced divers. They both went down to the bottom, and that, you know, in one hand you're holding the shot line, so you effectively slide down the shot line holding it in your hand until you hit the bottom. The problem is when you hit the bottom, it's a very, very fine silt on a lot of the docks, so that would quite often sort of poof up the, you know, the sort of silt on the bottom, puff up the silt, and could then affect the visibility quite badly. And sure enough, what happened was she got down initially quite happy, and then because they were moving around and moving around the shot line, all the silt was getting kicked up and stirred up. So very quickly she got into a blacked out situation with no visibility at all. And she had communications on, and basically you have a way of speaking to the surface. There's a push button that's effectively on your chin. She pushed the button and said, I don't like it, I want to come up. So she was encouraged to come up. She hadn't been down long enough to cause herself any problems. But she came to the surface with the other diver, and as soon as I looked at her eyes on the surface, I knew that, you know, she was never going to make a police diver. Lovely girl, but her eyes were massive. They were like saucers. And in the sport diving world, you see a lot of sport divers now, because they look cool. You know, they have these half masks that are mirrored sometimes, like sunglasses, or you can't see the person's eyes. I never like them particularly, because you can tell a lot from a person's eyes about how happy they are. And if they've got big headlight dinner plate eyes, you know, they're really not happy. And sure enough, when this girl came to the surface, that's the eyes she had. And we dragged her out, got her onto the surface, took her mask off, started sort of de-kitting her, and said, what did you think about that then? Although I already knew the answer. And she said, very straightforward, you know, thanks for the opportunity. It was great in the pool. I didn't like it down there at all. I'll never, ever do that again. I cannot do that, you know. And to be honest with you, that was the time to find out, before we sent her off on an 8-week course, a course that I was then going to obviously go on, if we come back now a few years, that I was hoping to go on myself. So ultimately I passed the aptitude test. They're there for a reason. They're there to filter people that aren't suitable for the team. Absolutely no shame in it at all. It's a very, very specific job, and it's definitely not for everyone. But I'm glad to say I got through the aptitude, and I got a date to go on to the course. And we'll talk about that next time, because we're just coming into the end of this episode. That's the process for getting on the team. And next week we'll talk about the 8-week course to become a police diver, which is ultimately a commercial diver. So you follow some of the commercial rules, but also there's obviously it's very heavily police diving led. You know, it lines you up and sets you up for becoming a police diver. Thanks for listening. Hope that was interesting. As I say, next week we'll get into the course itself. I think you'll find that interesting and how it all works. For now, take it easy and we'll speak again soon. All right, cheers, bye.